To our second annual Tropical Bonsai Roundup. Since I've gotten heavily into doing tropical bonsai over the past several years, I've been asked to do this presentation on tropical bonsai in general, and there are two reasons for it. One, their care requirements are somewhat different from pines and junipers and other temperate bonsai, but the second thing is you can work on tropical bonsai in the summertime. You can repot them, you can prune them back heavily, and in the case of most varieties, they actually prefer to be worked on in the summer. So let's get started with the large one here, the most noticeable one, I guess because of its size. This is your typical Ficus benjamina. People grow them in their living rooms and parlors because they grow well indoors. But interestingly enough, they also make really great bonsai. This particular ficus is quite familiar to my viewers on YouTube. It's been the subject of, I believe, either 3 or 4 videos so far. And this was originally grown from a large cutting that comprised the lower half of the trunk here. And it had just a little puffball of foliage when my wife bought it and then handed it off to me and said, make this beautiful, make a bonsai out of it. So I took it out of the flower pot that it came in and documented that on a YouTube video, put it in a large square training pot for a year, and then transitioned it into this pot. This isn't the final pot, but it is roughly the right size and shape, so it makes a good growing pot. Now, there are a couple of things about ficuses, one that applies specifically to ficuses, and the other one that applies to all tropical bonsai. And the first thing I want to talk about, you'll notice this tree has a lot of wiring on it, and that the wiring is a little bit loose and sloppy. Now the reason for that is ficuses grow very fast during the growing season. Last year this tree was wired and unwired 3 times during about an 8-week period. And the second thing is the wood is extremely flexible. Even though you wire a thin branch like this to shape, once you unwire it, until it gets to be roughly the thickness of a number 2 pencil like this first branch here, it's not going to take a set. They're going to keep springing back up like this one, and you're going to have to keep wiring them back down. Now, Ficus benjamina means weeping ficus, and their natural aspect is for the weight of the leaves on the branch tips to pull the branches downwards. So unlike pines and junipers where we wire them down to simulate snow load, with a ficus we wire the branch tips down to simulate the tree's basic growth habit. The other thing I want to mention is fertilizer. You'll notice there's a lot of black powder-like substance on all of my trees here. That is blood meal. It's a Miracle Grow Organic Series fertilizer. I use blood meal and bone meal now for the tropicals and for most of my other bonsais. And the thing I've noticed about the tropicals is they need 2 to 3 times as much fertilizer as a pine or a juniper. Literally, they will take up nutrients at a level that would burn or kill a pine or juniper, and it's because they're producing huge amounts of leaves, and in the case of other tropicals like this hibiscus that we'll get to in a moment, flowers. I have one other ficus here, and I'll bring this over to show you folks. And this is a starlight ficus, a variegated ficus, and we'll move our hibiscus out of the way so that we can bring this up here. And this is a nice little slant style tree. Now, ordinarily you wouldn't use variegated trees for bonsai, but ficus enthusiasts in the tropics do use variegated ficuses in order to get a little color as opposed to they're usually rather green. And this one is developing into a very nice little bonsai. So it's perfectly legitimate and acceptable to use a variegated ficus for bonsai. Almost in bloom. We've got one flower bud on the end here that is getting ready to pop, and in a week or 2 this thing is going to be covered with flowers all over the place. Hibiscus.
What color are they?
This one does them in a coral pink. There are 2 varieties of hibiscus. There's Hibiscus rosa sinensis, which is native to China and adopted as the official flower of Hawaii and South Korea and a lot of other places around the Pacific. And those come in a lot of different colors: yellow, white, pink, red, and various combinations of colors. Then there is a type we're asking about. This is a Cape honeysuckle. Now, these are not really tropical bonsai per se. They're more of a semi-tropical bonsai. But in terms of their care requirements and responses, they're more tropical than non-tropical. So we treat them as a tropical. Now, these are a shrubby vine. They're basically a shrub that sends out vine-like runners. And they make little groups of bright orange flowers, which is one of the big attractions in keeping them. And when they get old, they get really interesting bark texture. These, with a lot of these others, we work on them and we repot them in warm weather because that's where they're in most active growth. And unlike temperate trees, you don't have to catch them just when they start growing. You can repot them and work on them anytime they're in active growth and they don't have a problem with it. Cape honeysuckles, like I said, are a little more temperate. They come out of dormancy somewhat earlier than the ficuses, the hibiscus, and the Brazilian peppers do. And they actually seem to benefit from being repotted and pruned a little bit earlier in the season. Where my ficuses came out of dormancy somewhere in April, and the hibiscus came out of dormancy in late May, early June. The Cape honeysuckle came out of dormancy in March, just a little bit after the temperate trees did and started pushing growth. So they're similar to temperate trees in their responses. But these things, they're very vigorous, very hardy. They bud back nicely. You can cut them down to a bare stump and they'll push new growth almost wherever you cut them back from. This deadwood spike down here, I cut it and it didn't push new growth, but everywhere else I cut it, it pushed new growth. So almost all the time you cut it, you'll get new growth, but not every time. And this tree is quite familiar to my YouTube viewers. This was something that we acquired some years ago, and it's been through a couple of repottings and a lot of pruning. And I discovered recently that this tree, like the other ficuses, seems to really like large amounts of organic fertilizer. Unlike the Benjamin ficus, with Benjamin ficus, budding back can be a problem. If you cut back to bare wood, it's anybody's guess how much new growth you're going to get and where it's going to come from, so you have to be careful. The ginseng ficus, which is a cultivar of Ficus retusa, will bud out from wherever you cut it. So that's one thing they have going for them. The one thing that confounds a lot of bonsai people, other than true tropical bonsai aficionados, is the fact that they have these fat tubers at the base. And a lot of bonsai people like, oh, reverse taper, looks grotesque, whatever. My plan for dealing with that is I'm going to make this look like the ficus trees that I saw along the coasts in the Philippines and get some rounded gray granite rocks and wedge them in underneath the areas where it tapers in and make it look like it's growing out from between some boulders, which would be a perfect natural justification for the swelling. But other than that one thing, these work really well as bonsai because the leaves do diminish in size if you keep them trimmed back, do a little bit of leaf pruning, and keep track of your growth. And they bud back really well and develop really good branching if you prune them. So this tree, which basically was a little clump of leaves on top of that big, thick, tuberous trunk base, is actually starting to develop some really nice shape now. Yeah. This is a bonsai that I brought in a month ago. And this is responding really, really well to large amounts of organic fertilizer. It's getting Miracle Grow blood meal and bone meal. And it's in a really good free draining bonsai soil. And it's just pushing growth like crazy. Now, bougainvilleas are tropical trees. They're native to Brazil. Were discovered in Brazil in the late 1700s, became quite the rage in European greenhouses and conservatories in the early 1800s, and were exported throughout the British Empire and throughout the Spanish Empire to be used for landscaping wherever, which is how we got them here in California and how they made their way to the Philippines and India and a whole lot of other places where people might be tempted to think they're native, but they're actually not. They're what they call a transplanted native. In their native environment in Brazil, they're green all the time, they're growing all the time. Here in California, in a temperate climate, they become semi-deciduous, and they're very vulnerable to frost damage. I typically protect mine these days in the winter by pulling them in next to the exterior walls of the house. Since I have an old house that doesn't have insulation in the walls, the heat leaking out of the house from us heating the house at night keeps the area right next to the exterior walls about 20 degrees warmer than the ambient temperature. So if it's 29, 30 degrees out on the far ends of the yard, it may be close to 50 degrees next to the exterior walls of the house. And that keeps the bougainvilleas happy and keeps them from suffering frost damage, because they will die back if they are subjected to frosty conditions, and they'll either die entirely or die down close to the base, and then all your bonsai work for the year is gone. Even without frosty conditions, if they're subjected to a 50-degree winter, they become deciduous. They drop their leaves in the winter, and they go into kind of an interesting growth cycle in the spring. What they'll typically do is they'll push flowers first on the bare branches, and you get this beautiful mass of flowers, and then they drop all the flowers, then they start pushing leaves, then they flower again on the tips of the new growth, which is what you're seeing here. And it's interesting and it's fun to watch, but it can be extremely confounding if you're trying to get one ready for a bonsai show, because you're going to have timing issues. If the thing comes out of dormancy too early, then you end up with all the flowers gone and a massive bare twigs by showtime, or you end up with all the flowers gone and a bunch of green leaves, and you've got something that no longer looks like a bougainvillea, it looks more like a privet. So that's one of the things that we kind of have to struggle with, and one of the reasons why when I do get trees that bloom, I document them with photographs and I put them on my website. That way, if they don't make it into a show, then we can preserve their appearance for everyone to see. But this bougainvillea has been doing really well the past couple of years, and it's performed beautifully on the soil and fertilizer. I'm using my typical soil mix, which is decomposed granite, a little bit of builder's sand, some humus, and some organics. You have to put organic matter in with tropical bonsai, and I'll typically go 30 to 40% on the organic matter. I'll use whatever potting soil I find at Home Depot, Lowe's, the big box store, but I typically read the ingredients, make sure they don't have any moisture-carrying polymers or anything funny in there. When I'm talking organics, I want something that's mostly composted leaf and forest material or something like that. And if it's got a little bit of steer manure or whatever in it, that's fine too, because that gives the tree the nitrogen it needs if I don't go hard enough on the fertilizer. But this one is doing really well. This was anemic earlier in the year, and there was a picture on my website of it showing what happens when it exhausts all the soil and everything. And I repotted it once it came out of dormancy, and it started laying on the fertilizer, and it was covered with leaves a month ago, and I pruned it back, and then it was covered with leaves and growth again, and I pruned it back yesterday, and here it is now. So that's bougainvilleas, and that's our tropical bonsai roundup for this year.